Yeah, slug. Yes, our number 2 is engaging over. Hey. No!
Well, the South African government has finally shed some light on what exactly transpired over 3 weeks ago when the South African National Defence Forces troops in Eastern DRC lost their lives, 14 of them. That was a heavy blow to South Africa. South Africa is part of the SADC forces that are in DRC, part of the SAMI DRC, to help the DRC government to fight the insurgencies in Eastern DRC. Well, many asked questions of what exactly transpired, and the South African Parliament asked the Ministry of Defence to shed more light on exactly what happened in Eastern DRC that led to the loss of lives of 14 of the South African National Defence Forces troops. Well, that is part of the story that I'm going to tell you in this video, as well as the numbers that have been quoted by the Ministry of Defence of the death toll that happened on both sides, the South African side and the M23 side. That is the South African National Defence, or the Ministry of Defence of South African story of what happened 3 weeks ago in Eastern DRC. Well, this is Bonafide. If you haven't subscribed, kindly subscribe and hit that notification button so that when I release something new on South Africa and the DRC crisis, you get notified as soon as possible. Well, first of all, before we start, I want to sincerely thank you for the support that you have shown this account thus far. We have crossed the 10,000 subscriber, which is an amazing feat, putting in mind the time that we started all these analyses and making stories about what is happening in Africa and beyond. I sincerely thank you, and my commitment to you is that we will continue to give verifiable information as well as giving detailed analysis of exactly what is happening in Africa and beyond. Well, it was a shocker. What happened towards the end of January in Eastern DRC was a shock to many, as we heard about the 14 troops of the South African National Defence Forces that lost their lives in the fight in Eastern DRC. While we understand that in South Africa it was much of a concern about how the troops lost their lives and what transpired, the rest of Africa, of course, also had concerns about how such a huge force could lose such a lot of troops that were fighting in Eastern DRC. And many have been asking questions, and fortunately, even the parliament in South Africa had similar questions that many were asking. How did this happen? Well, the South African Parliament had very specific questions on this, and they asked the Ministry of Defence if the troops in Eastern DRC had sufficient military equipment to attack and defend themselves should such an attack take place when they were situated in Eastern DRC. And the Ministry of Defence was very quick to give answers about exactly what happened in Eastern DRC. According to the Minister of Defence, Angie Motshega, in South Africa, he said that the South African National Defence Forces, part of SAMI DRC, had sufficient military equipment to defend itself should there be any agitation from other forces in the country. And if I quote the words of the minister herself, she said that both contingents of SAMI DRC and MONUSCO had sufficient military equipment, including ammunition and defensive capabilities, during the battle with rebel forces in late January. Well, and many will ask if the force clearly had enough supplies to defend itself. And we're talking about the South African National Defence Forces, an elite force comparably with other military forces across Africa. If it had enough supplies to defend itself, then what really happened? Because if we analyze what exactly took place in Eastern DRC, 14 of the troops of the South African National Defence Forces is not a small number when you're talking about elite forces losing their lives. So many will ask the question if they were sufficiently stocked up with military supplies and what they needed to defend themselves in that particular onslaught, then what exactly happened? So the Minister of Defence went on to describes the exact situation in Eastern DRC as what happened in that fateful event. According to Moshega, the South African soldiers shot enemy in defense and killed a big number of enemy soldiers, estimated to about 800 enemy soldiers shot and killed. So she went forward to give us the number that when you're talking about the enemy right now, we're talking about the M23, because that is the South African National Defense statement, or the Ministry of Defense in South Africa giving this statement that they were able to neutralize about 800 M23 members in that particular onslaught. Well, this information is not verifiable because there were no evidence that were given about this particular event, the loss of 800 M23 members in that particular onslaught. Of course, we know that there could be death toll on both sides because it was a fierce fight and both of these forces had enough supplies to wage a serious war against each other. But currently what we know right now is that 1,000 to 2,000, we're not given the specific number, 1,000 to 2,000 South African National Defense Forces are surrounded in North Kivu. And that goes to say that the South African National Defense Forces were overpowered by the M23 in that onslaught in Eastern DRC because they raised the white flag, they surrendered in this particular onslaught, meaning that the M23 had enough firepower to make the South African National Defense Forces to give in the fight in Eastern DRC in late January. And now further questions will be asked of what was the shortfall, because if you have enough supplies to defend yourself and you know the kind of attacks that this enemy would wage on you, then what measures were you taking or what went wrong? Because right now you are surrounded. 14 troops of the SANDF unfortunately lost their lives. So what happened? According to the minister, she said that possible shortfall of ammunition happened due to the intensity of engagement with the enemy, meaning that perhaps there were a lot of M23 coming at the South African National Defense Forces troops, the camp that was in Goma, and that the ammunition that they had was not enough to defend themselves in that particular onslaught. That is the statement as it was read by the Minister of Defense of South Africa. It therefore means that it is either the South African National Defense Forces did not have quite enough of these military supplies to defend themselves, or the M23 had so much of the supplies that they overpowered the South African National Defense Forces. And this includes even the troops on both sides, that the M23 were quite many compared to the South African National Defense Forces and other SAMI DRC troops that were situated in Goma. So that is the kind of message that we are getting, which conflicts with the first question if the military was indeed well supplied with military equipment to defend themselves. It seems there was a shortfall. And many security analysts have pointed to the direction that without air support, it is very hard to defend yourself in such battlefields. The South African National Defense Forces, part of the SAMI DRC that is in Eastern DRC right now, does not have air support. And there was some interesting statement that was released by the South African National Defense Union National Secretary Picky Griff, and I'm going to quote what he said. He said that they are not safe, that is the military, the South African National Defense Forces troops in Eastern DRC, that they are not safe. The situation is too volatile. Truth of the matter is they are now bargaining chips in a greater scheme of things, especially because they are surrounded. There is no way of getting them out there to extract them, especially in a military sense. That is the National Secretary Picky Griff of South African National Defense Union. And he's saying that the South African National Defense troops in Goma right now, they are surrounded, they are just bargaining chips, and there is no way that they can be extracted from that particular surrounding militarily. There has to be a deal, some negotiation reached with the rebels so that they can't be released from where they are. And that is a sad situation for your troops to be in an active war zone. And even as more answers are being sought after on what exactly happened towards the end of January in Eastern DRC concerning the South African National Defense Forces troops, it is important to note that latest reports are pointing to the direction that the M23 is still continuing with its onslaught. It is gaining more territory in Southeast DRC, and that is part of the story that I'm going to tell you in the next video.